I'm going to tell you this story, and I know you won't believe it. That's all right. I lived through it myself, and there were moments when even I couldn't believe it. On October 26, 2025, I was kneeling on the patch of ground in front of my cabin, my hands cuffed behind my back, my face lowered toward the layer of rotting leaves. Two police officers stood behind me. Three neighbors stood in front of me, their arms crossed, looking at me the way people look at something they had suspected for a long time and had only now finally caught. The taller officer read me my rights. I heard every word and still couldn't make sense of any of it. Theft, trespassing, repeated systematic offenses. I, Harold Pemberton, 67 years old, living alone in a wooden cabin among the pine woods on the outskirts of Kalispell, Montana, was being arrested for stealing from my neighbors. I wanted to shout that I didn't do it, but my mouth was dry as dust, and maybe nobody wanted to listen anyway. Then it happened. From the edge of the woods, a moose stepped out. It was huge, its shoulder level with my chest when I stood upright, its gray-brown coat speckled with dried mud. It walked slowly, calmly, as if the whole group of people in front of it were nothing more than a few tree stumps. And in its mouth, held crosswise, was a shovel. The shorter officer took his hand off his gun. The neighbors stepped back 2 paces. No one said a word. The moose walked straight toward me, set the shovel down less than a meter from my knees, then turned and walked away. It did not look back. It was not in any hurry, as if it had just finished one item on its daily to-do list. When the shovel lay there, tooth marks were still visible on the wooden handle. The taller officer looked at the shorter one. The shorter one looked at the shovel. Then both of them looked at me. I wanted to say, "I told you so." But honestly, at that moment, my mouth was hanging open just like theirs. To understand why I was kneeling there, and why a moose was delivering a shovel like a mail carrier, you have to hear it from the beginning. I moved to this cabin after my wife died, 4 years ago. It sounds like something out of a movie, but the truth was simpler than that. The old house in town had too many things that reminded me of her. The chair she always sat in, the mug she never washed right away, the smell of hand lotion on the pillow. I couldn't bear it, so I left. The cabin is about a 40-minute drive from town. Nothing but pine woods all around. The nearest neighbor is half a mile away. I liked the quiet. Or at least, I told myself I did. The moose first appeared last fall. I was sitting on the porch at dusk, eating cookies, when I saw it standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me. Big, male. Its antlers had only recently shed their velvet, so they looked a little ragged. Its eyes were round, black, and strangely calm, like the eyes of someone who had lived long enough not to be afraid of anything anymore. I tossed it a piece of cookie. It sniffed it, ate it, and walked away. The next day, it came back. I tossed it another piece of cookie. Then, the day after that. And the day after that. Little by little, it became a habit. Every evening, around 6 o'clock, I would leave a few apples on the porch, some pieces of cookie, sometimes a few carrots. It would come, eat, stand there for a while, then disappear back into the woods. I named it Hank. No particular reason. It looked like a Hank. We didn't talk. Obviously, it was a moose. But there was something comforting in knowing that every evening, a living creature would stand a few meters away from me and ask for nothing except a few pieces of apple. Then the object started appearing. The first time, it was a gardening glove. It was lying right beside the porch steps early in the morning, still wet with dew. I thought the wind must have blown it there from somewhere. I picked it up, put it in the corner of the house, and forgot about it. 3 days later, a coil of rope. Then a pair of pliers. Then an orange baseball cap with the logo of a team I had never even heard of. I started to find it odd, but I still didn't think too much about it. When you live in the woods, things sometimes drift in by strange means. Wind, raccoons, some kid throwing a toy. I piled everything into a corner of the porch, thinking that the next time I went into town, I'd ask around to see whose it was. But I didn't go into town often, and the pile kept growing. A handsaw, a brand new screwdriver set still sealed in its plastic case, on a pair of large rubber boots, a blue plastic bucket. By this point, I was beginning to suspect something, but the idea that the moose is bringing me things sounded so insane that I pushed it away. My brain refused to process it. Until one night, around 2 in the morning, I heard a clattering sound outside on the porch. I turned on my flashlight and looked through the window, and saw Hank. It was standing there with a hammer in its mouth, its head tilted slightly to one side because the handle was longer than it had expected. It lowered its head, dropped the hammer beside the porch steps, then looked up, looked straight at the window, straight into my eyes, as if to say, "There, no need to thank me." Then it turned and ambled off into the darkness. I stood there for a long time, still holding the flashlight, my mouth hanging open, trying to understand what exactly I had just witnessed. My moose was a thief. Or more precisely, my moose was stealing things from the neighbors and bringing them to me as gifts, the way a cat brings a dead mouse home to its owner. While I was standing inside the house in shock, out there, the whole neighborhood was in an uproar for another reason. The neighbors had started losing things. Ed Kowalski lost a set of tools he had left in his open garage. Martha Jennings lost 2 flower pots from her porch. The Rivera family lost a folding chair, a shovel, and, I apologize in advance, a plastic lawn bird. The rumors spread fast, and they spread in only one direction, toward the cabin of the strange man who lived alone in the woods. On the morning of October 26th, 2 police cars pulled up in front of my house. I opened the door, still holding my coffee mug, and saw 2 officers and 3 neighbors standing there, staring at the pile of things on my porch. The pile I had kept thinking, "I'll ask around about it when I have time." Ed Kowalski pointed at the screwdriver set. "Mine." Martha pointed at the boots. "Mine." Mr. Rivera pointed at the plastic bird. "Mine." The coffee mug in my hand suddenly felt as heavy as lead. One of the officers asked if I wanted to explain. So I explained. I said I hadn't taken anything, that the moose had been bringing the things, that its name was Hank, that it came every evening to eat apples. I watched their expressions change from serious to pitying. That look was worse than hatred. They thought I was losing my mind. An old man who had lived alone in the woods too long, starting to go senile, stealing things and blaming it on a moose. The officer read me my rights. I was told to kneel down. My hands were cuffed. The 3 neighbors stood there watching, and in their eyes I saw something worse than anger. Confirmation. They had suspected me for a long time. The eccentric old man, living alone, never socializing. Of course it was him. I knelt there, my knees aching against the cold ground, thinking that my life had reached a new low I never could have imagined. Being arrested for stealing a plastic lawn bird. Then I heard the sound of a branch snapping at the edge of the woods. Everyone turned to look. Hank stepped out from the line of pines, slowly, calmly. Its coat glowed in the morning sunlight. And in its mouth, you already know this, was a shovel, and the wooden handle lay crosswise, the blade swaying a little with each step. No one moved. The moose walked straight across the clearing, past the 2 police cars, past the 3 neighbors standing there like statues, and stopped in front of me. It lowered its head, opened its mouth, and dropped the shovel. The metal hit the ground with a dry clank. Then it lifted its head and looked at me for a moment. That familiar look, calm, unapologetic, turned around and walked back toward the woods. Mr. Rivera, his voice so quiet it was as if he were afraid of breaking something, said, "That is my shovel." No one said another word for about 15 seconds. The taller officer, whose name I later learned was Officer Daniels, looked down at me, looked at the shovel, looked at the moose disappearing behind the trees, and said, "Mr. Pemberton, I think we need to reassess this situation." They uncuffed me. My knees hurt so badly I couldn't stand properly and had to brace myself against the porch post. In the following week, the police installed 2 dash cameras outside my cabin. And Hank, loyal like a delivery worker no one had hired, kept doing his job. The first night, a broom. The second night, a hose. The third night, a yellow hard hat that was later confirmed to belong to a construction site 2 miles away. The video was clear as daylight. The moose walked up carrying the object in its mouth, came through the woods, set it down on my porch, ate a few pieces of apple I had left out, and then left. The police closed the case. One by one, the neighbors came by to apologize. Ed Kowalski brought me a box of cookies. Martha brought me a new flower pot. Mr. Rivera stood at my door, scratched his head, and said, "Harold, I don't know what to say. Are you raising a moose or raising a thief?" I laughed. The first real laugh I had had in a very long time. That night, I sat on the porch as usual, put the apples out on a plate, waited. Hank came at exactly 6 o'clock. This time, there was nothing in its mouth. It ate the apples, stood there for a while, then looked at me. I looked back at it. "Hank," I said, "you almost got me sent to prison, you know that?" It blinked. Then it walked away. I don't know why it did that. Later, the experts said it might have been a form of gift-giving behavior. Some animals bring objects back to a food source, in the same way crows bring bottle caps to people who feed them. No such case had ever been documented before in moose. Hank, in some way, was the first recorded case. Or maybe it was simply a moose that liked picking things up. I don't know. And honestly, I don't need to know. What I do know is this. Before Hank appeared, I lived alone and thought I was fine with that. After Hank nearly got me thrown in jail, the neighbors started knocking on my door. Ed came by for Saturday morning coffee. Martha brought baked goods over every Sunday. Mr. Rivera sometimes sat and fished with me at the creek behind the house. Turns out, for people to really see you, sometimes it takes a moose stealing their shovel first. I still leave food out on the porch every evening, but now there's also a small sign stuck in the ground beside the plate of apples. I wrote it by hand, in crooked letters. "Hank, just eat. Don't bring anything back." It can't read. I know that. The next morning, there was a large green left flip-flop in front of my door. I sighed, picked it up. And for the first time in 4 years, and I drove into town, not to buy anything, but to knock on every door and ask, "Did anyone lose a flip-flop?"